Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Have you ever wondered what it might be like if the ship you are in sank during a vicious gale-force storm in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Well, as you heard in part one last week, that's just what happened to 12 men on a secret military mission out of Connecticut back in 1969. That's when their boat, the Sea Surveyor, sank a couple of 100 miles off of Nantucket Island. Well, back today is Walter Wally Banzhaf. He was the youngest person on board that ill-fated ship, and he's going to tell us the dramatic conclusion of the story that he started in part one, and he's going to let you know the fate of his 11 colleagues on board that day. When we last spoke with Wally last week, the ship had just sunk and the crew members were on a rubber life raft in 25-foot waves in the middle of the night. He'll be along in just a moment to pick up the story. This week's trivia question: this Connecticut resident and his son gave us 4 faces to remember forever. Who were they? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. In part one of this 2-part series, we heard from Walter Wally Banzhaf. He was on the 120-foot Sea Surveyor research vessel. Now, it was on a secret military mission about 300 miles south of Nantucket Island, basically in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, they were supposed to rendezvous with a nuclear-attack submarine that was underwater, of course, and then conduct radio frequency tests that was focused on whether the sub's communication system was working right. Now, when we left off the story, the boat that Wally and his colleagues were on had started to lean to the left so far that it was in danger of tipping over, and Captain Lane at the helm had given the order to abandon ship. One by one, they jumped 4 feet downwards from the listing ship into the rubber lifeboat. Now, when Captain Lane left the ship, and of course, as is customary, he was the captain, he was the last one off the ship, he had fallen into the Atlantic Ocean and it had to be pulled into the rubber lifeboat, and he was soaking wet at this point. Now, as survivor Wally Banzhaf recalls for us, there would be 12 men placed into this chaotic situation with only the slimmest chance of survival. Let's paint a picture of now what's going to happen. So there was a canopy on top of this life raft, but you were sitting in waves that were 20 to 25 feet high. And when you got to the top, the crest of one of those waves, you were in gale-force winds of 50 miles an hour. And then when the raft slipped down into the trough in between the waves, you wouldn't feel the wind, but you also wouldn't see anything until the next wave came. Can you begin to describe what that was like?
Well, mentally, I can only speak about my own feelings. I was kind of depressed. I thought it was very likely we're not going to come out of this. I guess engineers are traditionally known as very conservative. I was depressed. It was a time when no one was talking. Everyone was wrapped up in their own feelings. And we sat there, wet, cold, depressed. I can mention at this point that about 3 hours after we got in the life raft and were cut free from the Sea Surveyor, a ship came by. It was a very large ship. I don't know if it was 200 or 400 feet long, but I can tell you I looked out through one of the flaps on this life raft, which did in fact have a roof over it, a canopy, and had light, an emergency light on top that was steady white light to identify it if another ship should see us. And I looked out the flap and I was seeing a black hull of a large motor vessel, and I could see the rivets from about 20, 25 feet away. Had that 25 feet, not been there, it would have run us over and we'd all have perished right there. The amazing thing is they didn't see us. They didn't do anything about us. And had they run us over, they never would have known that it's probably like running over a cricket in your car. You would not notice that you're running over something so small.
I read somewhere that early on, probably in that first hour or so, you found a manual inside the life raft, and when you opened it up, the first line said something to the effect of, "Your situation is not hopeless."
It was funnier than that, I think. Yeah, I happened to be sitting right next to a big pouch, a waterproof pouch, and in it was survival equipment such as flashlights, a pump if we needed to pump out water, or reinflate any of the chambers on this inflated raft. There were survival things like water in cans, biscuits in cans. I should mention, by the way, that everyone was violently seasick, and it got worse in the raft for, I would say, the first 2 or 3 hours. And miraculously, suddenly, everyone got better. I guess the body said, "I have made you as miserable as humanly possible, and you've survived, so let's end it." So the body stopped being seasick. Yes, in there was a pamphlet from the some life raft company, Switlick Life Raft, and it said something like, "Congratulations. Many people have been in the situation you are now in, lost at sea or adrift at sea, having lost your vessel, whether it's a little sailboat or a giant boat like ours. And many people have survived because of the excellent life raft you're now in. So here I am in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of miles from shore, reading an advertisement about how good our life raft is." That was a little humorous, particularly after the fact, not so much at the time.
Now I'm going to go back to Captain Lane for a second. He did two things that, in retrospect, were really important. Number one, he did send out a distress signal before the ship was abandoned, but he also kept a secret on the raft, because what he didn't share, because I'm sure the mood was dire enough as it was, that there was a longshoreman strike on shore. And what did he end up telling you about that?
I guess he was reading something that sea captains would read, and he was well aware that, and the entire eastern seaboard had a longshoreman strike, and that meant that ships were not coming in to be unloaded because there was no one there to unload it. There were ships not departing; they were staying in port because there was no point in them going out empty. And because of that, the marine traffic was drastically down. I don't know by how much, but he knew that it made the chance of us being noticed and perhaps rescued by a ship passing by chance was drastically reduced.
We'll talk later about why others didn't respond to the distress signal, but for now, what I want to talk about is the S.E. Christine, the one ship that was sailing, and it was coming out of Hampton News, Virginia, heading to the Netherlands with a boatload of coal. And they asked you to go into that pouch of waterproof safety equipment and get the flare gun that you had found and use it, because it seemed that when you got to the top crest of a wave, you could see the lights of this boat far away, and they wanted to give it one shot to see if you could get that flare up into the air and let that boat know you were there. Would you pick up the story from there?
Yeah, exactly. So, Mike, a pouch with equipment had a flashlight. It had a mirror. So if in daytime you wanted to flash sunlight at a ship or a plane, you could do that. We never encountered sunlight. It was cloud cover the entire time. So when the light was sighted at the top of a wave, very briefly, every so often you could see, up, there's a light in the distance. I couldn't tell you how many feet or miles away it was. It was several miles, but it was a large ship. As it turns out, we didn't know then. And we could see the lights. So immediately, one person was holding the flashlight. They turned it on. And again, only at the top of the wave were they frantically waving the light to try to attract attention. It wasn't a steady light. It was someone moving it up and down to tell people there's a human doing this. And then, of course, we dropped down into the trough of a wave and couldn't see it anymore. So the captain said, we're going to launch a parachute flare. If you don't know what a parachute flare is, it's a gun. However, the barrel is quite large. It's about 1.5 or 2 inches in diameter. And you're not shooting a bullet, you're shooting a flare, like a road flare that you'd have on the highway if a car broke down, and a parachute. And when you pull the trigger, this explosion launches the thing hundreds of feet into the air. The parachute opens as it begins descending. The flare is already lit from having been ignited in the gun. And then a bright red light will slowly drift down. And this tells anyone who sees it two things. One, there's some people that really need help. You wouldn't launch a parachute flare unless you were in serious trouble. And two, it locates you so that even though they can't see the light on top of the canopy or the flashlight being waved, they can see that parachute descending right down towards your raft. I was told to take it out of the waterproof pouch. I leaned out through one of the flaps where the flaps are, an opening on the end of the raft. I was leaning out, about to pull the trigger, and a gust of wind capsized the raft. 8 men were thrown into the water, including me with a parachute flare, out of its waterproof package, and 4 men remained in the raft.
And then what happened? You were able to right the raft and get back in?
Yes, indeed. They have ropes that hang down normally from the top of the canopy. So when the raft is capsized and it's upside down, you can easily grab one of the ropes, get 2 or 3 folks on one side, and lean out like you'd hike on a sailboat, put your weight out to keep the sailboat as level as possible. And by pulling outward like that, our body weight would flip the raft over. And that's what it did. It righted itself. The raft had a little ladder built into it. It was nylon webbing, so you could step up 1 step at a time and climb back into the raft. Pretty soon, all 12 men were in. At that moment, I had one job, which was to lean out and pull the trigger on the parachute flare. I did, and there was a slight sound, and there was no explosion. There was no launching. The seawater had deadened the parachute flare gun.
So at this point, all you had left to notify them was a flashlight.
And thank goodness for Stanley. I believe it was Stanley Oleto who was the cook, and he happened to be the fellow who had the flashlight and was waving it. Then the raft capsized. Stanley stayed inside, and when we righted it, he still had the flashlight in his hand. And that was an old flashlight. I don't mean it was antique, but what I mean is it didn't have modern batteries. It didn't have an LED bulb. So our lives at that point depended on 2 ever-ready D cells, D batteries, and an incandescent bulb, which of course could have burned out from the impact of capsizing, but it didn't. And he kept waving that, and they saw us finally. The ship saw us, started heading towards us.
So now you're confident that the freighter's seen you, it's heading your direction. What happened next?
The ship did steam towards us, and it became not miles away, but maybe hundreds of yards away. And then, well, the ship was 825 feet long, so it was a gigantic thing compared to our tiny raft. And it positioned itself with great skill in a storm, with the waves, with the wind, and it positioned itself so it was attempting to block the wind so that it would drift into our raft, and then they could lower a rope. That was plan A. Plan A did not work. What happened is the wind coming over the ship and around the bow and the stern pushed our raft away faster than the ship itself was drifting. So they had to abandon plan A, at which point the ship steamed off without saying a word. Well, there was no way to say a word. We didn't have radios, we didn't have communication, and so the ship steamed away. That was a low point in our experience, I will tell you. The ship steamed out of sight, and we didn't know whether it had said, these waves are too dangerous, we can't endanger our ship. We wish them well in the raft, but we can't do that. That's not what happened. The captain, with enormous skill, was able to back the ship up, remembering where we were, and position it so that the raft was on the windward side, and the wind pushed us into the side of the Essie Christine, and then they lowered a rope to us. We're bouncing up and down like crazy. The raft was really going up and down hugely. They towed us around to the leeward side, dropped the cargo net, and indeed, 10 men were able to climb up rather quickly, I would say. And it was huge motivation to get off that raft. Two people were so hypothermic, and we were all at that point probably a few hours away from dying from hypothermia, where the body just stops working. The first thing to go is the mind, and then the operation of the muscles. And these two fellows, they were in pretty good shape, but they were so cold that their muscles were not responding. I don't remember seeing this because I was already on the ship. Two Norwegian sailors climbed down and helped the guys up, probably carried them on their shoulder. Very shortly, all 12 of us were aboard, safe, wet, drenched, freezing, shivering, but alive and very happy.
Just phenomenal. So, Wally, once you guys got on the freighter, I guess they gave you some dry clothes for starters and maybe even some scotch, I heard somewhere. But what was it like on the freighter?
The freighter had been built 1 year prior. It was brand new. Everything sparkled. Everything was clean as a whistle. And these were Norwegians. They have been, seafaring people since before Viking times. They know how to run a ship. The Essie Christine, as with all Norwegian ships at that time, required that 24/7, whenever the ship engines were on, there was a sailor standing out on what's called the fly bridge. Inside the bridge, you have light, you have heat, you have comfortable chairs, you have your navigation, you have your radar equipment. That's where the captain or who is ever in charge of the ship would be. Outside is some poor guy on a 4-hour watch in the weather, with the wind, with the snow, with the sleet, with binoculars. And his job is to do one thing: look and see what's ahead of us. And this man saved our lives because he saw us with his binoculars. He alerted the officers on the bridge. And that is why. That's perhaps why that first ship, 3 hours after we got in the life raft, didn't see us, because they don't have. The Norwegians have always required that person be on the outside. Once we were up on the deck, we're soaked. Every particle of our body is covered with salt water. Our clothing was soaked. There was some, how shall we call it, antifreeze solution given to us. It came in a bottle that was marked Johnny Walker Red. And cold and shivering, we were very happy to celebrate our survival. Just then, still out on the deck, the captain comes down with a rifle. We didn't know what was going on. And he starts shooting. Fortunately, we found out he was shooting the life raft because he didn't want it to be a hazard to navigation. No ship should put itself at risk in a storm trying to rescue an empty life raft, which had done its job and kept us alive. So he was trying to put holes in all the flotation chambers and the light. The first thing he shut out was the light, and hopefully the thing sank. The next morning, we had breakfast, and around 11 o'clock in the morning, suddenly the engine stopped on this giant 825-foot ore-carrying freighter. We didn't know what's going on. Being an engineer, I figured something went wrong with the engine. They ran out of fuel. Who knows? It turns out we were not now over 12,000 foot deep water, but we were over George's Bank, where it's maybe 100 to 150 feet. And what do you have there? You have fish, you have cod, you have sharks, you have mollusks, you have shrimp, you have scallops, whatever you want is down there. And the captain likes to fish whenever they're over good water. So he orders the engine to be stopped. And about half an hour later, the engine started up again. Then we had our 10-day trip to Holland. However, that afternoon, the Coast Guard cutter Vigilant out of New Bedford raced to intercept us on our path. The Essie Christine had to deliver the coal. It had no choice. It could not deliver us personally. So the Vigilant came, and we were standing on the deck of the Essie Christine, and the Vigilant was maybe 200 yards away. and we were losing sight of this 210-foot Coast Guard cutter in the waves. That's how big the waves were. At which point, both captains, Captain Lane, Captain Hawkinson of the S.E. Christine, and the Coast Guard captain all agreed we're not going to use the breeches buoy to transfer the men one at a time, because if we survived, we would be soaking wet once again.
You have been trying to find some special records of the inquiry that was held because, somewhat ironically, while everybody survived and there was no action taken against the captain, no findings of any problems, yet the final decision, the findings of the investigating officer, were never disclosed. And you've been looking for them, and you haven't been able to get them, have you?
That is correct. Approximately a week after we returned, the Coast Guard sent up a lieutenant commander, and in a room at Electric Boat, a corporate conference room, there was a person operating a recorder. Each person was interviewed individually. From that inquiry, Lieutenant Commander Tanos went back to the New York office of the Coast Guard, generated a report. It took over a year. I never saw it at the time. I heard from people at Electric Boat that they were unable to determine the specific cause of the sinking. And now it seems to have disappeared from the face of the earth. I cannot explain how. It's not available. There's no record of it. I have been to every federal agency. I requested help from a state senator. Nothing has materialized.
In all, the 12 crewmen were in the rubber lifeboat for 26 hours, more than a calendar day, in a gale-force storm with biting cold winds, unpredictable waves, and deep doubts, of course, about any chance of survival. Today, Wally gives presentations about this incident all over New England to, as you can imagine, amazed audiences. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, 3 of the 12 crew members from that ill-fated voyage are still alive. Wally says one of them doesn't travel anymore, so the 3 of them keep in touch by email. And yes, they do still exchange their recollections from 50 years ago. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Walter Wally Banzhaf, one of the 12 survivors of the sinking of the Sea Surveyor research vessel back in 1969, as well as a longtime professor of electronic engineering technology at the University of Hartford. The answer to this week's trivia question, well, the question was, this Connecticut resident and his son gave us 4 faces to remember forever. Who were they? The answer, Gutzon Borglum. He's the infamous sculptor who, way back in the 1920s, was commissioned as the leader of the project to build Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to speak with a Mount Rushmore representative about the unbelievable influence and importance of Gutzon's role, not to mention the impact as well of his son, Lincoln. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.